Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing chapters in Appalachian religious history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned 3 generations and left a scar on the landscape of eastern Kentucky, where a single church defied all expectations of divine protection and left a legacy so dark that the ground itself became known as cursed. Some called it the Devil's Ground. Others wouldn't speak its name at all. And those who knew the full history understood that sometimes the earth itself refuses to forget. It was the year 1893. The Gilded Age was transforming America's cities into glittering monuments of progress and industry. Electric streetlights illuminated the avenues of Manhattan. The Chicago World's Fair was showcasing humanity's technological marvels to millions of visitors. Telephone lines connected distant cities. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the continent. America was hurtling toward the 20th century with unprecedented confidence. But in the isolated hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, the situation was drastically, almost impossibly different. There, between mist-covered peaks that rose 3,000 feet above sea level and deep valleys where the sun barely penetrated for months at a time, communities lived virtually cut off from the rest of the world. They were connected only by dirt trails that became impassable rivers of mud during the endless months of rain that defined Appalachian springs. The nearest town with a telegraph office was a 3-day journey on horseback through treacherous mountain passes. The nearest railroad station was even farther. Time moved differently in these mountains. Old grudges lasted generations. Old beliefs ran deeper than any modern rationality could reach. The ways of the ancestors held more authority than any government law. And in a clearing beside Blackwater Creek, on a plot of land that the Cherokee had refused to settle for reasons they would only speak of in whispers, stood a church that would burn 3 times before the century ended, 3 times, each fire more mysterious than the last, each burning more devastating to those who witnessed it, each conflagration marking another chapter in a story that would become legend in the region, a cautionary tale passed down through generations, a mystery that even now, more than a century later, defies complete explanation. This is the story of Redemption Hill Baptist Church. This is the story of Reverend Josiah Thornton, a man whose faith became his fatal flaw. This is the story of the Devil's Ground, and of what happens when human stubbornness collides with forces that refuse to be dismissed or controlled. This is a story about respect, about memory, about the price we pay when we refuse to listen to those who came before us. The church was called Redemption Hill Baptist, though the hill it sat upon had no official name on any map. The locals had their own words for it, passed down in whispers from generation to generation, names that changed depending on who was speaking and how much they trusted their listener. The elders remembered when their grandparents spoke of the place in the old tongue, before English became the dominant language of the region, before the Cherokee were forcibly removed on the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. They said the ground was Eily Unalanv, a Cherokee phrase that meant, roughly translated, earth that remembers evil, or, in some dialects, ground that keeps count. The church itself was modest, especially compared to the grand structures rising in American cities during that era. Built in 1878 by a congregation of 15 families, it stood as a simple wooden structure with a pitched roof designed to shed the heavy mountain snows. Inside, hand-hewn pews provided seating for perhaps 60 people if they squeezed together. Windows made from salvaged glass purchased secondhand from a demolished courthouse in Pikeville caught the light in strange, refractive patterns that painted rainbow colors across the wooden floor. During morning services, The building materials came entirely from the surrounding forest. Oak and pine cut from the mountain slopes by the congregants themselves. Limestone mortar mixed from the creek bed. Nails forged by Samuel Hutchins, the local blacksmith, who charged only the cost of the iron because he believed in the Lord's work. But the land was the problem. The land had always been the problem. Reverend Josiah Thornton, who founded the church, had purchased the plot for almost nothing. $5 and a handshake from a landowner named Jacob McAllister, who seemed almost relieved, almost desperate to be rid of it. When Thornton asked why such prime land flat, cleared, near fresh water was selling for a fraction of its value, McAllister had looked away toward the mountains and said simply, "It ain't a place for the living, never has been, but if you're determined, I won't stop you. Just don't say I didn't warn you." Thornton was a circuit preacher from Winchester, Virginia, educated at a small seminary, filled with the fervent belief that God's Word could take root anywhere, could flourish even in the most resistant soil. He was 40, 2 years old when he arrived in Pike County, accompanied by his wife Elizabeth, a woman known for her kindness and her remarkable singing voice. He saw the cheap land as providence, divine favor, a sign that God wanted his house built in this exact spot. He saw the superstitions of the mountain people as exactly the kind of backward, pagan thinking his ministry was meant to combat and correct. The congregation saw it differently, though few spoke their concerns aloud at first. Mountain people understood the value of silence. They understood that some knowledge was dangerous to share openly. The clearing where Thornton built his church had a history that predated white settlement by centuries, possibly by millennia. The Cherokee hunting parties who once moved through these mountains with the changing seasons had avoided this particular grove for as long as their oral traditions extended. Their stories spoke of a massacre that occurred long before European contact, long before Columbus, long before written history touched these mountains. It was a conflict between rival clans, the stories said, a dispute over hunting rights or marriage agreements or sacred ground. The details varied depending on who told the tale, but the outcome was always the same: 37 people killed in a single night. Men, women, children, no survivors, no mercy. The bodies, according to the stories, were left where they fell. In those days, there was no one left alive to perform the proper burial rites. The soil drank their blood. The earth absorbed their suffering, and the ground, in its own way, remembered. When white settlers arrived in the early 1800s, following Daniel Boone's wilderness road into Kentucky's uncharted territories, they found the clearing empty, pristine, strangely untouched by the dense undergrowth that choked every other open space in the forest. The grass grew thick and green, but no trees sprouted there. Deer avoided it, though they grazed in clearings all around. Birds didn't nest in the surrounding trees, even though the branches provided perfect shelter. At night, the temperature dropped 10, sometimes 15 degrees colder than anywhere else in the valley, a phenomenon that settlers attributed to cold air flowing down from the mountains, though that explanation never quite accounted for why it happened only in that specific spot. The first white family to try settling on the land was the Brennans, Irish immigrants who arrived in 1823. They built a cabin right in the center of the clearing. It burned down 3 weeks later. Lightning strike, people said, though there had been no storm that day. The Brennans rebuilt. The second cabin stood for 2 months before the entire family fell ill with fevers. 2 of their children died. The survivors moved away and never returned to Pike County. After the Brennans, the land changed hands multiple times. A merchant from Virginia bought it, planning to build a trading post. He never even started construction. He visited the site once, stood in the clearing for 15 minutes, then rode directly to the land office and sold the property at a loss. A speculator from Tennessee purchased its site unseen, arrived to survey his investment, and lasted one night camping there before leaving and never coming back. Letters from that period, preserved in county archives, mention unnatural cold and voices in the darkness, and a feeling of being watched by something that means harm. By the time Jacob McAllister inherited the land from his father in 1875, it had developed a reputation throughout the county. People called it the Bad Ground or the Widow's Clearing, the latter name stemming from the fact that 3 men who owned it had died young, leaving their wives bereft. McAllister wanted nothing to do with it. He refused to even visit the property. When Reverend Thornton arrived, fresh from Virginia with his education and his certainty, McAllister saw an opportunity to be rid of a burden. But Thornton dismissed such talk as superstition, pagan nonsense, the exact kind of backward thinking his ministry was meant to combat. He'd read accounts of missionaries who brought Christianity to foreign lands, who built churches on the sites of heathen temples, who conquered spiritual darkness with the light of the gospel. He saw himself in that tradition. He believed, with absolute conviction, that consecrated ground could overcome any history, any curse, any darkness. He was catastrophically wrong. The construction of the church began in May of 1878. Thornton led the effort personally, working alongside his congregation, swinging an axe, hauling timber, driving nails with his own hands. The work was hard but fulfilling. The building rose slowly through the summer months. The frame went up in June. The walls were completed in July. The roof was finished in August, just before the autumn rains began. But even during construction, there were signs, small things that could be explained away individually, but that accumulated into a pattern the mountain people recognized even if Thornton refused to. Tools would vanish and reappear in impossible locations. A hammer left on the ground would be found on a roof beam 30 feet up. Nails poured into a buck, it would disappear overnight. Timber carefully measured and cut to specific lengths would be inches too short when they came to install it, forcing them to redo the work. Samuel Hutchins, the blacksmith, mentioned that every piece of iron he forged for the church took twice as many attempts as normal, the metal refusing to cooperate, cracking and warping in ways he'd never seen in 20 years of working his craft. The congregation tried to tell Thornton, gently at first, then more directly, but he interpreted their concerns as weak faith, as spiritual cowardice. He preached about Joshua conquering Jericho, about David defeating Goliath, about faith the size of a mustard seed moving mountains. He convinced himself that resistance was proof of importance, that the devil only fought against projects that threatened his kingdom. The church was completed in September of 1878. The congregation held their first service on a Sunday morning that began with clear skies and ended with a thunderstorm so violent that 3 homes in the valley lost their roofs. Lightning struck a massive oak tree beside the church, a tree that had stood for 200 years, splitting it down the center with a crack that sounded like cannon fire. The tree fell, missing the church by less than 10 feet. Thornton took this as a sign of God's protection. The tree had been struck, he said, but the church stood untouched. Victory over darkness. The congregation wasn't convinced. But they came to services, they sang the hymns, they listened to the sermons, they prayed, and slowly, gradually, they began to notice things. The first months passed without major incident. Families gathered every Sunday for morning services. Children memorized Bible verses in Sunday school classes held in the afternoon. The women organized quilting circles that met on Wednesday evenings. their needles flashing in the candlelight as they worked on blankets for the poor. The men discussed crops and weather and politics after services, their voices carrying across the clearing as they lingered in the autumn sunshine. It was a normal rural church in every visible way, but beneath the surface, things were not normal. Beneath the veneer of routine worship, the congregation began to notice patterns that disturbed them, phenomena that accumulated slowly enough that no single event seemed worthy of alarm, but that, together, painted a picture of something deeply wrong. The candles inside the church wouldn't stay lit during evening services. They'd flicker and die, even when there was no draft, no wind, no logical explanation. The women who cleaned the church tried every remedy they knew. They trimmed the wicks shorter. They bought better quality candles from a supplier in Pikeville. They shielded the flames with glass chimneys. Nothing worked. During Wednesday evening services, when darkness fell early in the winter months, people would bring 4 or 5 candles each, knowing that they'd go through all of them before the service ended. Thornton insisted it was poor quality wax, inadequate ventilation, the natural quirks of an old building. The congregation knew better. The church was new. The ventilation was fine, and the candles worked perfectly everywhere else. Then came the sounds. During quiet moments, when the preacher paused in his sermon to let a point sink in, when the hymns ended and silence fell before the next verse, when people bowed their heads in prayer, they heard things, a rhythmic tapping beneath the floorboards, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking in a pattern. 1 tap, pause, 3 taps, pause, 1 tap, over and over. At first, people assumed it was settling, the new wood adjusting to its environment. But settling doesn't follow patterns. Settling doesn't respond to human activity, because the tapping did respond. When Thornton raised his voice during sermons, the tapping would speed up, becoming almost frantic. When the congregation sang loudly, the tapping would stop completely. When they fell silent, it would resume. And there were whispers. Multiple people heard them independently, then hesitantly confirmed their experiences with each other in private conversations after services. They were voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves, too faint to make out individual words, but clearly the sound of people speaking. Sometimes it sounded like arguments, sometimes like crying, sometimes like singing in a language no one recognized. Once, during a Wednesday prayer meeting in November of 1878, every person in the building, all 20, 3 of them, heard what sounded like children crying in the woods outside, crying in pain, in fear, in desperation. The men grabbed lanterns and rushed out to search, thinking some child had become lost in the forest. They searched for 2 hours, calling out, their voices echoing through the mountains. They found nothing. No children, no footprints in the soft earth, no sign that anyone had been there at all. When they returned to the church, cold and confused, they found all the candles lit and burning steadily. Every single one, even though they'd left them guttering and dying before they ran outside, even though no one had remained inside. Sarah Blackburn, a young mother of 3, stopped bringing her children to services after her youngest daughter, 5-year-old Emma, asked why the dark people were standing in the corners watching everyone. When Sarah asked what she meant, Emma pointed to the empty corners of the church and described them in detail. They don't have faces, she said matter-of-factly, with the unsettling clarity children sometimes possess. Just darkness where their faces should be, and they're sad. They want us to leave. Sarah questioned her daughter gently. Was Emma making up stories, playing pretend? Emma insisted she could see them every time they came to church. Mama, can't you see them? They're right there, pointing, always pointing to empty air. Other children reported similar experiences, though their parents hushed them, told them not to speak of such things, tried to convince them it was imagination. But too many children, who had never spoken to each other about it, described the same thing: figures in the corners, dark shapes watching them, the sense of being observed by something that didn't want them there. Still, Reverend Thornton persisted. He interpreted these events as spiritual warfare, the devil testing their faith, evil spirits attracted to the presence of godliness, trying to disrupt holy work. He preached longer sermons about standing firm against temptation, about putting on the armor of God, about spiritual battle. He organized more prayer vigils. He led the congregation in songs of spiritual warfare. He convinced himself and his most devoted followers that they were engaged in a holy battle for the soul of this land, and that retreat would be tantamount to surrender. "We do not abandon battlefields," he thundered from the pulpit. "We do not flee from the enemy. This ground will be claimed for Christ, regardless of what darkness opposes us." The congregation's attendance began to thin. Families who had been founding members started making excuses. One family moved away entirely, relocating to relatives in Tennessee. Others simply stopped coming, choosing to worship in their homes or travel the extra distance to churches in neighboring valleys. By the winter of 1879, regular attendance had dropped to about 30 people, and then came the winter of 1892 to 1893, the coldest winter in living memory, the winter when everything changed. Snow fell for 3 weeks straight in January of 1893, piling up to the windows of cabins, drifting over the lower branches of trees, burying the trails completely. Temperatures plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. Families burned through their carefully hoarded wood supplies in days and huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Game disappeared from the forests, driven to lower elevations or holed up in dens. Creeks froze solid. Children developed fevers that lasted weeks, their small bodies struggling against the relentless cold. The elderly suffered particularly badly, their joints aching, their lungs laboring in the frigid air. And people started dying. Old man Silas Crawford was the first, 73 years old, strong as an ox despite his age, never sick a day in his adult life. He'd been a pillar of the church since its founding, never missing a Sunday service regardless of weather or his own health. He taught Sunday school to the men's class, led prayer meetings, donated generously from his modest farm income. His faith was genuine, deep, unshakable. He died in his sleep on a Tuesday night in late January. His wife Miriam found him in the morning when she woke to light the stove. At first, she thought he was still sleeping. Then she touched his face and found it cold as the winter air outside. She called for him, shook him, screamed his name. The neighbors heard her wails and came running. When they examined his body, preparing it for burial, they found something that disturbed them deeply. His face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. His hands clutched around his throat, the fingers dug into his own flesh hard enough to leave bruises, as if he'd been strangling himself in his final moments. The doctor who traveled up from Pikeville, a 2-day journey in good weather, 4 days in the snow, examined the body and attributed it to heart failure. Natural causes for a man of 73 years. But Dr. Harrison also mentioned, quietly, to those who pressed him, that he'd never seen a heart attack present with such violent physical symptoms. "It's as if he died fighting something," Harrison said, "but there are no wounds, no signs of struggle with another person, just fear, pure, overwhelming fear." The funeral was held at Redemption Hill Baptist, as Silas would have wanted. The service was on a Thursday afternoon. 20 people braved the snow to attend, trudging through drifts that came to their waists in places. The sky was gray and low, pressing down on the mountains like a weight. The temperature hovered around 0 degrees. And during the funeral, strange things happened that would be discussed in whispers for years to come. The coffin lid kept falling open, no matter how many times they secured it. Samuel Hutchins had personally installed the latches, good iron work that should have held. But 3 times during the service, the lid swung open, revealing Silas's terrified face to the congregation. Finally, they gave up and left it open, covering the body with a quilt. During the eulogy, given by Reverend Thornton in his most solemn voice, every window in the church shattered simultaneously. Just exploded inward, glass flying across the pews. There was no wind, no impact, no explanation. One moment the windows were intact, the next they were destroyed. People screamed, children cried, several people were cut by flying glass, though none seriously. Thornton tried to continue the service, shouting over the chaos, but people were already fleeing. They'd had enough strangeness, enough inexplicable events, enough fear. When they carried Silas's body to the small cemetery behind the church, the frozen ground split open before they even began digging. A crack appeared in the earth, perfectly coffin-sized, about 6 feet deep, as if something beneath was making room. The crack ran straight down, smooth, sided, impossible in frozen ground that should have been hard as stone. The men lowered the coffin quickly, shoveled dirt over it, and left. No one lingered, no one spoke. They just went home and tried to forget what they'd seen. But the deaths weren't finished. 3 more deaths followed in quick succession over the next 2 weeks. Martha Hendricks, 60, 8 years old, found dead in her rocking chair. Young Thomas Wright, only 27, collapsed while chopping wood and never rose again. And Reverend Thornton's own wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Thornton's death shook the community most of all. She was beloved by everyone who knew her, gentle, kind, devoted to helping the poor families in the valley, bringing them food when they were hungry, medicine when they were sick, comfort when they were grieving. She had no enemies. Everyone agreed she was the best among them, a true Christian in the purest sense of the word. She died after attending an evening prayer service at the church on a Tuesday in early February. The service had been small, only 7 people, including Elizabeth and her husband. They'd sung hymns, prayed, discussed scripture. Nothing unusual happened, nothing frightening. It was just a normal service. Elizabeth walked home through the snow just after dark, following the trail she'd walked hundreds of times. Their cabin was only a quarter-mile from the church. The Reverend stayed behind to bank the fire and lock the church door. He expected to find her warming herself by their stove when he arrived home 15 minutes later. Instead, he found her in bed, under the quilts, cold as winter stone. No marks on her body, no signs of illness, no struggle, no explanation. She looked peaceful, as if she'd simply decided to lie down and never wake up. But her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and Josiah could never shake the feeling that she'd seen something in those final moments. Something that made her give up, let go, surrender. He buried her behind the church, beside the others who had died that winter. He preached at her funeral, though his voice broke multiple times. He quoted scripture about God's mysterious ways, about reunions in heaven, about faith in the face of loss. But everyone who attended, and there were fewer than a dozen people, could see that something had broken inside him. And he continued preaching, every Sunday, every Wednesday. His sermons became more frantic, more desperate. He spoke of Job's trials, of Abraham's test, of faith refined by fire. He insisted that these deaths were not judgments but refinements, not punishments but purifications, that God was testing them, testing him, and that passing the test meant not yielding, not retreating, not abandoning the ground they'd consecrated. The congregation dwindled to almost nothing. By early March, only 6 people came to Sunday services. By mid-March, sometimes only 3. The church sat mostly empty, its pews holding more ghosts than living congregants. And on the night of March 19, 1893, someone burned the church to the ground. It happened around midnight. The flames were visible from miles away, a pillar of orange and red light reaching toward the winter sky, illuminating the valley with a hellish glow that people said they could see from as far as 10 miles away. Those who witnessed it described the fire as unnaturally bright, burning with an intensity that seemed impossible for a simple wooden structure. By the time anyone could respond, the building was completely engulfed. The heat was so intense that people couldn't approach within 50 yards. They stood in the snow, their faces orange in the firelight, and watched it burn. The hand-hewn pews that men had crafted with their own hands. The salvaged glass windows that had cost more than they could afford. The Bible that had sat on the pulpit, Thornton's personal copy with his handwritten notes in the margins. The songbooks, the altar, the cross, everything reduced to ash and charred timber in less than 2 hours. The heat was strong enough to melt snow in a 50-foot radius around the church. The ground beneath turned to mud. And in that mud, when the fire finally died down and dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, people saw footprints leading away from the ruins. But they were strange footprints, too large, with an odd shape that didn't match any boot anyone recognized. And they led into the forest and simply stopped, just ended in the middle of a clearing, as if whoever, or whatever made them, had simply vanished into the air. Sheriff Coleman Hawkins arrived the next afternoon, having ridden through the night when word reached him in Pikeville. Hawkins was a practical man, 48 years old, with no patience for mountain superstitions or ghost stories. He'd been a lawman for 20 years, had seen murders and robberies and every kind of human vice. He dealt in evidence and facts, not feelings and folklore. His investigation was thorough but brief. He examined the ruins carefully, sifting through the ashes with a long stick, studying the pattern of burn marks on the ground. His conclusion was straightforward: arson. Someone had doused the building in kerosene. He could still smell traces of it in the debris, and set it ablaze deliberately. The fire had been set in multiple locations simultaneously, at all 4 corners of the building, to ensure complete destruction. But who and why? Hawkins interviewed everyone in the valley, every family, every person who'd attended the church, everyone who'd had disagreements with Thornton. He took his time, making careful notes, looking for inconsistencies in stories. He found nothing concrete, no witnesses, no confessions, no physical evidence beyond the kerosene and those strange footprints that led nowhere. Reverend Thornton had his suspicions, and he voiced them loudly to anyone who would listen. He believed it was someone from the congregation, someone weak in faith, someone who let fear override devotion. He pointed fingers, made accusations, named names. He claimed that Thomas Wright's brother Samuel had threatened to drive out the devil if the Reverend wouldn't abandon the church. He suggested that Martha Hendricks's son had blamed the church for his mother's death. He implied that several families had conspired together, meeting in secret to plan the destruction. His accusations divided what remained of his community. Families stopped speaking to each other. Old friendships dissolved. People who'd helped each other through harsh winters and failed crops turned their backs on one another, suspicious and angry. But others had different theories, and they spoke them in hushed tones when Thornton couldn't hear. Some said it was the Cherokee spirits, finally acting to cleanse the desecrated ground. That the ancestors whose bones lay beneath the church had reached up through the earth and pulled the building down into flames. They pointed to those strange footprints as evidence surely no human made those tracks. Others believed it was judgment from God himself, a cleansing fire to purify the cursed earth. That the Almighty had grown tired of Thornton's stubbornness, his refusal to heed warnings, his insistence on building where he shouldn't. Like Sodom and Gomorrah, they whispered, like the cities of the plain, destroyed for defying divine will. A few suggested that one of the families who had lost someone that winter took revenge, blaming the church for the deaths. That grief and anger had driven someone to strike back at the building that had become associated with so much loss. This theory made sense to Sheriff Hawkins, but he could never prove it. Everyone who'd lost family members had alibis. Everyone claimed to have been home, asleep, miles away when the fire started. The truth was never determined. No one was arrested. No one confessed. The case remained officially open, but practically abandoned within a month. And Reverend Josiah Thornton, broken by the death of his wife, by the destruction of his church, by the accusations and counter-accusations that had torn his community apart, should have walked away, should have accepted defeat, should have recognized that some battles cannot be won through stubbornness alone. Instead, within 6 months, he began planning to rebuild. People thought he'd lost his mind. Friends from Virginia wrote letters begging him to return home, to accept a position at a church there, to leave Kentucky and its darkness behind. Members of his former congregation pleaded with him to let it go, to accept that the ground was wrong, that some places should remain empty. Even Sheriff Hawkins, practical and unsentimental, took him aside one afternoon and said plainly, "Reverend, you're going to get yourself killed, or worse, whatever happened there, whether it was arson or something else. It's a message. Maybe you should listen." Thornton wouldn't hear it. He'd become obsessed, consumed. His wife's death, rather than breaking his resolve, had hardened it. He spoke of her grave, behind where the church had stood, and insisted that abandoning the site would be abandoning her. He spoke of the 4 deaths during that terrible winter, and said their memory demanded that the work continue. He spoke of spiritual warfare and refusing to surrender to evil. His behavior became erratic. He spent hours at the burn site, kneeling in the ash, praying aloud. He stopped sleeping regularly. He lost weight. His hair, which had been dark brown when he arrived in Kentucky, turned gray within months. People who saw him said his eyes had changed, developed a fevered intensity, a look of desperate determination that made them uncomfortable. But he had money. He'd inherited property in Virginia, small farms and parcels of land that he liquidated. He sold everything, converted it all to cash, purchased lumber from Tennessee, brought in by wagon over the mountain roads, hired workers from outside the county, men who didn't know the history, who saw only wages and work. Construction began in April of 1893, barely a month after the first church burned. And despite everyone's warnings, despite the history, despite the signs that any reasonable person would have heeded, Reverend Josiah Thornton began to build again on the devil's ground. The second church was completed in October of 1893, just 7 months after the first one burned. It was larger than the original, grander, built with imported lumber from Tennessee rather than local wood, as if the Reverend believed that materials from outside the cursed valley might carry less darkness. The design was more elaborate, with a proper steeple and a bell tower, with glass windows specially ordered from a manufacturer in Cincinnati, with carved details on the door frames that must have cost a small fortune. Thornton funded the entire construction himself. He wouldn't accept donations, wouldn't allow the community to contribute. This was his mission now, his personal crusade, and he seemed determined to see it through regardless of cost or consequence. Only 8 families attended the dedication service on October 15th. The rest of the original congregation had moved away, scattered to other valleys and other churches, or simply stopped practicing their faith altogether. The deaths of that winter, the burning of the church, the accusations and divisions, it had broken something in the community's spiritual life that couldn't be easily repaired. The 8 families who attended did so more out of curiosity than devotion. They wanted to see if lightning would strike twice, literally or figuratively. They wanted to see what would happen next in this increasingly dark story. For the first year, nothing dramatic occurred. No deaths, no supernatural occurrences, no flickering candles or mysterious sounds. The church stood solid and silent. Services were held every Sunday, though attendance remained sparse, sometimes only 4 or 5 people sitting in pews designed for 80. Thornton preached to his small audience with unwavering conviction, his sermons growing longer and more intense as the months passed. He took the absence of incidents as vindication. He'd won the spiritual battle, he told himself. God had blessed his perseverance. The devil had been defeated through faith and determination. He wrote letters to seminary friends in Virginia, describing his victory, encouraging them to never give up in the face of opposition. Then came October of 1894, exactly 1 year after the church's dedication. A traveling preacher named Micah Patterson arrived in Pike County. Patterson was well known throughout Kentucky and Tennessee as a fire and brimstone evangelist, a man who could speak for 3 hours without pause, whose voice could carry across packed revival tents without amplification. He claimed to have witnessed demonic possessions in Louisiana, said he'd performed exorcisms in Mississippi, insisted he'd cast out territorial spirits from haunted houses in Alabama. He was 46 years old, charismatic, confident, and he heard about Redemption Hill Baptist and the strange history surrounding it. He saw an opportunity, a challenge, a chance to demonstrate his spiritual authority on a stage that would make his reputation. Patterson visited Thornton personally, speaking of his experience with spiritual warfare, his success in cleansing cursed locations. He proposed hosting a week-long revival at the church, 7 nights of intense prayer and preaching, meant to cleanse the land once and for all, to break whatever curse or darkness lingered on devil's ground. He spoke with absolute confidence, citing biblical precedents, describing past victories, assuring Thornton that together they could finish what had been started. Thornton, desperate for validation and hungry for any kind of success, agreed immediately. They announced the revival throughout the county and beyond. Word spread quickly. People were curious, some were believers. Others were skeptics who wanted to see what would happen. Still others came from morbid fascination, the same impulse that draws crowds to disasters and tragedies. The revival began on Monday, October 15, 1894. The first night drew 30 people, the largest gathering at the church since its rebuilding. Patterson preached for 2 hours about territorial demons, about ancient evil that attached itself to places like parasites. His voice boomed through the church, dramatic and compelling. He spoke in tongues, the strange syllables flowing from his mouth while congregants watched in amazement or skepticism. Each night the crowds grew. By Wednesday, 50 people attended. By Friday, 70. Word was spreading. People came from neighboring counties, curious about the famous evangelist and the supposedly cursed church. Patterson's sermons grew more intense each night. He performed laying on of hands healing, though those who received his prayers showed no visible improvement. He called out demons by name Moloch, Baal, Legion, commanding them to depart. He led the congregation in hours of fervent prayer, their voices rising in unison, creating a sound that echoed through the valley. Thornton stood beside him through it all, energized, hopeful, believing that finally, after years of struggle, victory was at hand. The seventh and final night was scheduled for Saturday, October 20th. Patterson announced it would be the climax, the moment when he would perform a ritual of consecration that would cleanse the ground itself, break the curse permanently, free the land from whatever. Darkness held it. 67 people attended that night. The church was packed, standing room only, bodies pressed together, the air thick with the smell of sweat and candle wax and fervent belief. Children sat on parents' laps. People stood along the walls. The atmosphere was charged, expectant, electric with possibility. Patterson began his final sermon at 7 o'clock. He paced the small space before the pulpit, his voice rising and falling in practiced cadence. He spoke about the power of God to overcome any evil, any curse, any darkness. He quoted Ephesians, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." At exactly 9:30 in the evening, in the middle of Patterson's longest and most passionate prayer, a sound erupted from beneath the church. It started as a rumble, deep, subsonic, more felt than heard. The floorboards began to shake. Dust fell from the rafters in cascades. The candles flickered. People looked at each other with wide eyes, unsure if they should be alarmed or if this was part of Patterson's spiritual theater. Then the rumbling grew louder, deeper. The entire building began to vibrate. The glass windows rattled in their frames. The wooden walls creaked and groaned. It felt less like earthquake and more like the earth itself was groaning, protesting, awakening. And then the smell hit them. It was the scent of rot, of meat gone bad in summer heat, of mass graves and battlefield carnage, of decomposition and decay concentrated into an olfactory assault so overwhelming that people immediately began to gag. Within seconds, half the congregation was vomiting, doubling over, desperately trying not to inhale. Patterson tried to continue. He raised his voice, shouting his prayers over the chaos, commanding the demons to depart in the name of Jesus Christ. But his words were drowned out by the sound from below and the screams of the congregation. Then the crack appeared. It started at the front of the church, right beneath the pulpit where Patterson stood, a hairline fracture in the wooden floor. Then it widened, inch by inch, spreading down the center aisle like a zipper opening, and from that crack came a sound that witnesses would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. It was part scream, part laughter, part something that human ears were never meant to process. A sound that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the primitive parts of the brain responsible for pure, instinctual terror. Several people described it later as the sound of countless voices crying out in agony and rage simultaneously. Others said it sounded like the earth itself screaming. The congregation fled. They poured out of the doors, climbed through windows, trampled over pews in their desperation to escape. 67 people running into the October night, many of them never to return to any church again. Some described seeing shapes in the shadows beneath the floorboards as they fled, dark forms moving in the crack, reaching upward with what looked like hands. Patterson himself was found the next morning sitting on a tree stump a quarter-mile away, staring at nothing. His eyes were open but unseeing. When people spoke to him, He didn't respond. When they touched him, he didn't react. It was as if his mind had simply departed. He was committed to an asylum in Louisville 3 weeks later, diagnosed with severe catatonic shock. He never spoke coherently again. Doctors said he would occasionally mutter the same phrase over and over: "The ground remembers. The ground keeps count." He died in the asylum in 1903, having never recovered his sanity. Reverend Thornton was devastated, but, impossibly, still not defeated. He boarded up the church, said he needed time to pray, to understand what went wrong, to develop a new strategy. He spent weeks inside the boarded structure, sleeping in the pews, reading his Bible aloud to empty air, singing hymns to himself. People in the valley heard him sometimes at night. His voice carrying through the boards, preaching to no one, arguing with invisible opponents, declaring his determination to not be moved from his purpose. On November 12, 1894, the church burned for the second time. This fire was fundamentally different from the first. Multiple witnesses from across the valley saw it start. They described the same impossible thing. The building burst into flames simultaneously at all 4 corners, as if the structure itself had spontaneously combusted. There was no smell of kerosene this time, no signs of arson. The flames were an unusual blue-white color at their core, burning so intensely that stones in the foundation cracked from the heat. The church was completely destroyed in less than an hour. The bell in the tower melted. The imported glass windows turned to liquid. Nothing remained but blackened foundation stones and twisted metal. And when the ashes cooled 3 days later, Sheriff Hawkins and his deputies found something that changed everything. They discovered bones in the ruins, human bones. At first, they assumed these were from the cemetery behind the church, somehow disturbed by the intense heat. But when they checked, the cemetery was completely undisturbed, every grave intact, every marker still standing. These bones came from beneath where the church had stood, from the ground underneath where the altar and pulpit had been located. As they excavated carefully, using hand tools and brushes like archaeologists, they found more and more. Layer after layer of human remains, 37 sets of bones, men, women, children, showing clear signs of violent death. Skulls cracked by blunt force, ribs broken, evidence of blade wounds scored into the bones themselves. Some of the skeletons showed defensive wounds, arms broken as they tried to ward off attacks. Others showed evidence of being killed while trying to flee. The Cherokee stories had been true. The massacre had been real. Every detail matched. 37 people killed in a single night, centuries ago. And Reverend Josiah Thornton, in his determination and hubris, had built his church twice directly on top of their unmarked mass grave. The discovery was documented carefully. A Cherokee elder from a neighboring county was consulted. He performed ceremonies over the remains, speaking words in a language few people in Pike County understood, prayers meant to help trapped spirits find peace. The bones were excavated with reverence, wrapped in clean cloth, and reburied in the church cemetery with proper markers. A memorial service was held, led by the Cherokee elder with Reverend Thornton in attendance, his face haggard, his eyes hollow with dawning understanding. The ground was blessed according to multiple traditions, Cherokee, Christian, even some old Celtic rituals that the Scottish, descended families remembered. Surely, everyone said, surely now the land could rest. Surely now the spirits could be at peace. The dead had been acknowledged, their grave marked, their suffering recognized. Justice, in a sense, had been served. Josiah Thornton should have accepted this as the end, should have recognized that his mission, misguided from the start, had reached its natural conclusion. Should have walked away with whatever dignity he had remaining. Instead, within 6 months, he began building the third church. The third church took 3 years to build. Thornton was 60, 3 years old when he started construction, 66 when he finished. He did the majority of the work himself. His hands, once soft from years of scholarly work, became calloused and scarred. His back bent from hauling timber, his face weathered like leather under the mountain sun. The few men who helped him did so out of pity, not faith. They couldn't bear to watch an old man destroy himself alone. They brought tools, contributed labor. But they wouldn't pray with him, wouldn't attend services. They helped him build his monument to obsession, then left him to his fate. This iteration of Redemption Hill Baptist was smaller than its predecessors, simpler, just a one-room structure with 4 walls, a roof, and 6 handmade pews. No elaborate steeple, no bell tower, no ornate windows, just a plain wooden building that looked more like a barn than a church. The dedication service in April of 1897 was attended by 12 people. Most came out of morbid curiosity or pity. Thornton preached about Job, about persistence through suffering, about faith tested by fire. His voice was hoarse. His hair had gone completely white. His hands shook as he held his worn Bible, the same one he'd carried from Virginia 20 years earlier, its pages dog-eared and stained. Services were held sporadically over the next 14 months. Attendance ranged from 3 people to occasionally just Thornton himself, preaching to empty pews, singing hymns alone, taking communion by himself. People in the valley said he'd lost his mind, that grief and guilt had broken something essential in him, that he was more ghost than man now, haunting the place that had destroyed his life. Nothing dramatic occurred during those months. The church stood. The ghosts, if they existed, remained quiet. Perhaps they were satisfied. Perhaps they were simply waiting. Then came the summer of 1898, the hottest, driest summer anyone could remember. Drought conditions persisted from May through August. Crops withered in fields. Wells ran dry. The Blackwater Creek, usually flowing strong enough to turn a mill wheel, dwindled to muddy pools connected by trickles. Temperatures exceeded 95 degrees for weeks at a stretch. The forest became tinder, dry. On the night of June 23, 1898, lightning struck the church. But this wasn't normal lightning. It happened during absolutely clear skies, not a single cloud visible, stars brilliant overhead, no storm anywhere within 100 miles. Witnesses across the entire valley reported seeing the same impossible thing, a single bolt of white light, so bright it hurt to look at, descending from empty sky and striking the church roof directly on its peak. The building exploded into flames immediately. The dry timber caught like gunpowder. Within seconds, the entire structure was engulfed. Flames reached 30 feet into the night sky, visible from 10 miles away, turning the valley orange with hellish light. And Reverend Josiah Thornton was inside. People rushed toward the fire from their homes, pulling on pants and boots as they ran. They arrived to find the building fully involved, heat so intense it singed their faces from 50 feet away. Through the windows, simple openings with no glass, they could see him. He was standing at the pulpit position, his arms raised toward the ceiling, his mouth moving as if he were preaching, praying, or singing. They couldn't hear his voice over the roar of the flames, but they could see his silhouette, black against the fire, perfectly still except for his moving lips. Men shouted for him to run, to get out, to save himself. He didn't respond, didn't turn toward their voices, didn't acknowledge them in any way. Thomas Hendricks, Martha Hendricks's grandson, grabbed a bucket and tried to approach the door. The heat drove him back after 3 steps, Samuel Hutchins attempted to break through a wall with an axe. The burning wood was too hot to touch. They could only stand and watch as Josiah Thornton remained at his post, preaching to flames, while his church burned around him for the 3rd and final time. The roof collapsed at 12:45. The walls fell inward minutes later. By 1 in the morning, only embers remained, and somewhere in that wreckage was whatever was left of Reverend Josiah Thornton. They found his body the next morning after the ashes cooled enough to search. Burned beyond recognition, but still in the pulpit position, still standing somehow, his bones fused in that upright posture, still facing where his congregation would have sat, and beneath him, miraculously untouched by the fire that had consumed everything else, was his Bible. The pages were intact, the text readable, only the leather cover had charred. It lay open to the book of Job, chapter 30, 8. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. The coroner determined the cause of death as fire and smoke inhalation, an accident, a tragedy, but everyone in Pike County knew better. They'd watched a man choose his death. They'd witnessed the final act in a 20-year tragedy of obsession, hubris, and refusal to listen to wisdom. After Thornton's death, something fundamental changed in the valley. People reported that the temperature around the church site normalized immediately. The oppressive cold that had persisted there for 2 decades vanished overnight. Birds returned to the surrounding trees the very next day, singing in branches they'd avoided for a generation. Deer were spotted in the clearing within a week. The sense of wrongness, of spiritual oppression that everyone had felt, simply lifted. It was as if Thornton's death had finally satisfied whatever debt the ground demanded, as if his life, given willingly in the place of his obsession, had been the sacrifice required to balance the books. No one ever built on that land again. The foundation stones were left where they fell, gradually sinking into the earth. The cemetery remained, tended by distant relatives and local historical societies, but the clearing where 3 churches had stood was abandoned to the forest. Over the decades, nature reclaimed the devil's ground. Vines grew over the blackened stones. Young trees pushed up through the ruins. Moss covered the remnants. The forest, patient and persistent, slowly erased the evidence of humanity's stubborn refusal to listen to accumulated wisdom. But stories persisted. Throughout the 20th century, people reported phenomena near the old site. Unexplained lights at night, floating between the trees, the sound of hymns sung by no visible choir, the harmonies perfect and haunting, the smell of smoke on windless days when no fire burned anywhere in the valley. Hikers who stumbled upon the ruins felt overwhelming compulsion to leave, to show respect, to not disturb what rested there. The Cherokee community performed ceremonies at the site multiple times over the decades, trying to help the spirits rest properly. Christian ministers from various denominations held services there, blessing the land according to their traditions. In the 1970s and 80s, New Age practitioners conducted their own rituals, burning sage and speaking of energy and healing. Whether these helped remains unclear. The land stayed empty, avoided, marked on local maps with vague warnings about difficult terrain, and no established trails. In 1993, exactly 100 years after the first burning, a group of paranormal investigators from the University of Kentucky visited the site. They brought electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, digital recorders. They spent 3 nights camping near the ruins, documenting everything meticulously. Their findings were published in a small academic journal dedicated to paranormal research. They recorded temperature fluctuations of 20 degrees within seconds. Electronic equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, draining fresh batteries in minutes. Their recordings captured voices speaking what linguistic experts identified as archaic Cherokee dialect, saying phrases that translated to "remember us," and the ground keeps count. One researcher, Jennifer Walsh, described an experience on their final night. Sitting where the altar would have been, just after midnight, she was overcome by what she described as absolute, crushing sorrow. She wept uncontrollably for exactly 7 minutes, feeling grief she couldn't explain or attribute to her own life. Then it vanished completely, leaving her shaken and questioning everything she thought she understood about reality. The last documented incident at the Devil's Ground occurred in 2007. A developer from Lexington purchased the land, planning to build a luxury retreat center. He hired contractors to clear the site and begin construction. On the first day of work, 3 workers were injured. One by a falling stone that seemed to change direction in midair. Another when his excavator's hydraulics failed catastrophically. The third when he stepped on apparently solid ground that suddenly gave way, dropping him into a previously unknown cavity. The project manager shut down the site immediately. The developer came personally to assess the situation. While he stood in the clearing reviewing architectural plans, a wind arose, strong enough to rip the papers from his hands and scatter them into the forest. And in that wind, multiple witnesses heard what sounded like a child's voice saying, clearly and distinctly, "No." The developer abandoned the project that afternoon. He sold the land to a conservation trust with the legal stipulation that it remain undeveloped in perpetuity. A small plaque was placed at the trail head noting the historical significance, but providing no details about what happened there. Today, the clearing where Redemption Hill Baptist Church burned 3 times remains empty. The foundation stones are mostly buried under decades of fallen leaves and forest growth. The cemetery is maintained by volunteers, visited occasionally by descendants of those buried there or by people interested in dark history. And people still report hearing things at night, the church bell that no longer exists, hymns sung in 4-part harmony by voices that seem to come from underground, the smell of smoke when there's no fire in the valley. The story of Redemption Hill Baptist Church and the Devil's Ground remains a disturbing reminder that some places carry memories we cannot fully understand or control. Whether you believe in curses or spirits, in territorial demons or residual hauntings, certain facts remain undeniable. 37 people died violently on that ground centuries ago. Their graves went unmarked and unacknowledged. 3 churches were built on top of them. All 3 burned. 5 people died during those 20 years. And one man sacrificed everything: his wife, his ministry, his sanity, his life, because he refused to acknowledge that some ground demands respect rather than conquest. Was the land truly cursed? Were the fires punishment from offended spirits? Or were they results of human fear, superstition, and perhaps deliberate action? The truth likely lies somewhere between supernatural and psychological. The Cherokee avoided that ground based on accumulated wisdom. Early settlers noticed the same unsettling qualities, but dismissed them. Thornton saw opportunity and interpreted resistance as spiritual warfare rather than respecting those who came before. Perhaps the real curse was never supernatural. Perhaps it was the human curse of hubris, the belief that faith alone could overcome history, the conviction that determination could triumph over respect, the dangerous idea that past suffering can be simply built over rather than acknowledged and honored. But questions remain. Why did all 3 fires occur under such different circumstances? Why did the oppression lift only after Thornton's death? Why do electronics still malfunction there? Why do so many unconnected people report identical experiences? Science offers explanations. Electromagnetic anomalies from mineral deposits, infrasound from wind patterns causing unease, the power of suggestion creating shared psychological experiences. These are valid, documented explanations for haunted locations. But they don't explain everything. They don't explain why 37 sets of remains were found exactly where tradition said. They don't explain the timing, the patterns, the way the land resisted occupation for over a century. To this day, the clearing beside Blackwater Creek remains silent. Hikers who find it report peace now, as if whatever unrest once inhabited the land has been satisfied. The forest has reclaimed the site. Trees grow through the old foundations. Life has returned. And on certain nights, when the wind moves through the valley just right, when the temperature drops and mist rises from the creek, people still hear something that sounds like a church bell, ringing slow and measured, 3 strokes, then silence, 3 strokes, then silence, like a count, like a reminder. Some say it's wind through hollow trees. Others believe it's the land itself keeping count, reminding anyone who listens that the ground remembers. That some places hold their history in ways we're only beginning to understand. That respect and remembrance matter more than we often realize. The Devil's Ground stands as testament to what happens when we ignore accumulated wisdom, when we prioritize determination over respect, when we refuse to acknowledge that some battles cannot be won, some ground cannot be claimed, and some suffering cannot be simply buried and forgotten. Reverend Josiah Thornton believed his faith could conquer anything. He was wrong, but perhaps his final act, whether conscious choice or tragic accident, gave the spirits what they needed. Acknowledgement, sacrifice, an end to violation. Perhaps that's why the land finally rested. Perhaps that's why peace finally came. Or perhaps the ground simply grew tired of teaching the same lesson to people who refused to learn. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest mysteries has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between faith and obsession, between honoring the past and being consumed by it, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the seriousness and respect they demand. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment. Comment with your thoughts on the nature of cursed places, whether such things truly exist, and what Reverend Thornton should have done differently. Share your own experiences with places that felt wrong, land that seemed to remember, ground that refused to forget. Until next time, remember that history has long memory. The ground beneath our feet remembers everything, and some lessons can only be learned through suffering. Thank you for joining us on this journey into darkness. We'll see you in the next episode of The Untold Hour.